When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. The memory of that moment is etched into me, not like a scar, but like a fossil, a perfect, preserved impression of the instant my world shifted on its axis. I can still see her face, so clearly it's as if I'm standing there again, my damp hands clutching a dish towel, the steam from the sink still curling around my wrists. She was in the kitchen doorway, a silhouette against the bright, sterile light of the hallway, and she was holding a single piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was thicker, glossier. A brochure. The kitchen itself seemed to hold its breath around us. This room I knew so intimately, every cupboard hinge that squeaked, the exact spot on the counter where the morning sun would fall and warm the tile. This was where I had spent 2 years trying to earn my keep, to be useful, to turn their house into a home with the only language I knew. The simmer of a pot of chicken soup on a cold day, the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread, the careful organization of the pantry so David could always find his favorite crackers. I had learned the intricacies of their expensive espresso machine, memorizing which button made the latte Clara liked before her long commute. I had wiped countless spills from this very counter, spills from their hurried breakfasts, from wine glasses set down too carelessly during parties I'd help clean up after. This kitchen was my domain, my offered-up love made tangible in every cleaned surface and prepared meal. And now, she stood in its entrance, not coming in, blocking it, that piece of paper in her hand like a verdict. "Mom," she said. She still called me Mom then, and the word felt like a shell, something hollow and habitual, all the warmth sucked out of it. Her voice was quiet, but it wasn't the quiet of kindness. It was the quiet of precision of a rehearsed speech delivered with clinical calm. It was cold, final. Each word felt placed, considered, like stones being laid to seal a tomb. "We think it's time for you to have your own space again." She paused, perhaps waiting for a reaction I didn't give. I just stood there, the dish towel becoming a twisted rope in my hands. "We found a place for you, a lovely senior community. It's better for everyone." Better for everyone. The phrase hung in the air between us, toxic and polite. My eyes drifted past her, through the wide archway into the living room. There, on the large gray sectional sofa they'd bought last year, the one I thought was terribly uncomfortable, sat my son, David. My boy. He wasn't looking at us. His head was bowed, the blue glow of his phone screen illuminating the familiar, beloved lines of his face in the dim room. His shoulders were hunched, curled in on himself, a posture of such profound avoidance it was a scream in the quiet house. He didn't say a word. He didn't come to stand beside her in a show of united front. He didn't come to stand beside me in a show of filial protection. He just sat there, immobile, silent, complicit. And in that silence, in that complete and total abandonment by my own child, I felt something deep within my chest break clean in two. It wasn't a dramatic, shattering break. It was a small, definitive snap. The sound a dried leaf makes when you crush it in your palm. A life, once green and supple, now rendered fragile and final. And so I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or understanding. It was a physiological reaction, a dam against a flood. It was the only muscle in my face I could trust. If I let my lips relax, they would tremble. If I opened my mouth to speak, a wave of raw, animal sob would tear out of me. If I moved a single step, my knees would buckle and I would crumple to the floor right there on the kitchen tiles I had mopped just that morning. So I let this strange, serene smile settle on my face, a mask of perfect, placid acceptance. I nodded slowly, as if considering a mildly interesting suggestion. I reached out and took the glossy paper from her hand. My fingers didn't brush against hers. It was a careful, surgical transfer. I looked down at it. Sunset Springs, it read in cheerful, cursive font. There were pictures of smiling white-haired people with perfect teeth, playing bingo on a sun-dappled patio, doing gentle water aerobics, holding hands on a garden walkway. It was a brochure for a pleasant, peaceful exile. "Thank you for thinking of me," I heard myself say. My own voice sounded distant, filtered, like I was hearing it from the bottom of a deep well. It was calm, polite, utterly devoid of the earthquake happening inside. "This looks very nice." I turned then, the movement slow and deliberate, as if I were walking through deep water. I walked out of my kitchen, past my silent son in the living room, down the hallway with its perfectly arranged gallery of their vacation photos I was not in, and into the little room at the back of the house. They called it my suite. It had been their study, a place for paperwork and a sleek laptop before I arrived. Now it held the condensed archive of my life. 2 years of existence, pared down to a single bed, a dresser, and a collection of boxes in the closet that held what was left of my 68 years. The ghost of my old house, of my life with Tom, lived in those boxes. I closed the door softly behind me and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The brochure felt heavy in my hands. I stared at it, but the images of happy seniors blurred into meaningless color. Then I looked at my own hands, resting in my lap. These hands, now speckled with age spots, veins rising like gentle rivers under the skin. These were the hands that had cradled David's newborn head, so small and fragile, against my chest. They were the hands that had rocked him through fevers, guided his fingers as he learned to tie his shoes, bandaged scraped knees in the driveway. They were the hands that had clutched Tom's in his final days, a silent anchor of love. They were the hands that, trembling with grief and hope, had packed my life into boxes after he was gone, trusting the promise in my son's voice when he said, "Come live with us, Mom. We have plenty of room. We want you here." Every crease, every scar, every worn knuckle told a story of a love given, of care provided, of a family nurtured. And now, those same hands held the evidence that that love, that care, that family, had been deemed inconvenient. I didn't cry. The tears were there, a vast frozen ocean locked somewhere behind my ribs. I couldn't access them. All I felt was a hollowing out, a profound and terrifying emptiness. It was as if my heart had simply evaporated, leaving behind a cavern of quiet, cold dust. The realization was absolute, and it was merciful in its clarity. I was not wanted. I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched their evolving decor. A well-loved but outdated armchair, to be replaced with something sleeker, less sentimental. I was a responsibility that had quietly, without my noticing, transformed into a burden. The weight of my presence, my needs, my very existence in their space, had tipped some invisible scale, and the solution was my removal. The pain was not sharp. It was a vast, dull ache of erasure. But as I sat there in that silent, beige room, surrounded by the boxes of my past, a strange and quiet thought began to stir in that hollow space. It wasn't a thought fueled by anger or a desire for vengeance. Those would come later in flickers. This was different. It was a deep, intuitive knowing, a quiet voice from a part of my soul I'd forgotten existed. It was a simple, clear sentence that formed in the emptiness. This isn't how the story ends. This moment, this cold, polite betrayal in the kitchen was not the final note. It was a brutal turning of a page, yes, but the book was not yet closed. I didn't know how I knew it. I had no plan, no secret knowledge. I just felt it with a certainty that felt older than me. Somewhere in the great, slow-moving balance of the universe, this was not the last word. People call it karma, but that word can sound so vengeful. To me, in that moment, it simply felt like consequence. It felt like the fundamental law that every action sends a ripple into the world, and those ripples eventually find the shore. Actions that fracture a sacred trust, the trust between a mother and the child she raised, the implicit promise of care in one's twilight years, those actions don't just vanish. They have weight. They have a trajectory, and eventually they circle back. I realized then why I had smiled in the kitchen. That smile was my first unconscious step out of the role they had written for me, the role of the helpless, burdensome mother, the victim of their difficult but necessary decision. In that smile, I had stopped being an actor in their drama. I had become the witness. I would pack my boxes. I would go to Sunset Springs. I would live my small, quiet life. But I would watch. I would wait. Not with the burning thirst for revenge, but with the weary patience of someone who understands that seeds planted, whether in kindness or in cruelty, always grow. I would wait for the quiet, inevitable settling of the scales. This is my story. It is a story about the bones of family, how they can bend, and how they can sometimes break. It's a story about a love I believed was as constant and sure as the northern star, and the shattering vertigo of discovering it was not. And it's a story about how life, in its own slow and often mysterious way, has a method of teaching the hardest, most necessary lessons to those who need to learn them most. This is what happened after my son and his wife betrayed me, and this is how, when I least expected it, karma finally stepped in. To truly understand the depth of the hurt, the sheer scale of the betrayal that would later freeze the tears in my throat and leave only a ghost of a smile. You have to first understand the love that built me. You have to travel back, not just in years, but in feeling, to a world painted in softer, warmer colors. You have to picture our family, not as it shattered, but as it was woven together, thread by precious thread, in a little house on Maple Street. My Tom and I, we weren't rich people by any measure the world uses. Tom worked at the Clayton printing press, a job he held for 42 years. He'd come home with the faint, sharp scent of ink and paper clinging to his clothes, a smudge of black often gracing his temple or the back of his hand like a badge of honest work. His hands were big and capable, permanently etched with fine, dark lines that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase, a map of a lifetime of providing. I worked part-time at the town library, a haven of quiet and stories that suited my soul. Our world was small, contained within a few square miles of familiar streets, friendly faces at the grocery store, and the slow, predictable turn of seasons in our own backyard. But my goodness, it was bright, and its brightest, most brilliant source of light was our David. He was the kind of child who laughed with his whole body, a true sunshine boy. His joy was a physical force. He didn't just giggle. He would throw his head back, his entire frame shaking, his eyes squeezing shut until they were mere crescents of pure delight, often collapsing in a heap on the floor as if the laughter had simply overwhelmed his ability to stand. Our living room was a perpetual construction site for blanket forts, elaborate architectures that consumed every cushion from the sofa, every spare quilt from the linen closet, held together with clothespins and sheer childhood determination. I'd trip over stacks of books meant to be walls and find him nestled inside with a flashlight, a king in his cotton castle. He'd help me bake, standing on a wooden stool worn smooth by generations, his small hands clumsy but earnest, leaving a trail of flour footprints from the counter to the fridge that I would gaze at later, my heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful. He'd sit on the porch with his dad for hours, fixing a broken radio or a squeaky hinge with a toy hammer, their heads bent close together in serious consultation, Tom's low, patient murmur mixing with David's high, earnest questions. Our house was a house of laughter, yes, but also of simple, tangible joys. It was the soundtrack of Tom's old records spinning on the turntable, the smell of grass after David mowed the lawn for the first time, the clatter of Monopoly pieces on a rainy Sunday afternoon. It was macaroni art, gloriously messy and glitter-coated, proudly displayed on the refrigerator for years until the pasta loosened and had to be tenderly retired. It was bedtime stories that went on a little too long because neither of us wanted the spell to break. Me reading until my voice grew hoarse, him fighting sleep with every fiber of his being, his small hand resting on my arm to ensure I wouldn't stop. It was a world built on presence, on looking into each other's eyes across the dinner table, on knowing the sound of each other's footsteps on the stairs. It was a tapestry of a million tiny, ordinary moments that, woven together, created something extraordinary, a secure, unshakable love. When Tom got sick, the laughter in our house didn't vanish, but it changed its tone. It became quieter, more precious, often tinged with a bravery that broke my heart. David was a teenager then, all long limbs and cracking voice, straddling the line between boy and man. He watched his strong, solid dad, the man who could lift him onto his shoulders with one effortless heave, grow thin and frail, the printing press ink on his hands seeming darker against his paling skin. He saw me, trying to be the rock, trying to hold the pieces together with a smile that sometimes trembled at the edges. And my boy, my sunshine boy, stepped up. Without being asked, he'd make simple dinners, grilled cheese sandwiches, a pot of spaghetti, presenting them with a quiet seriousness. He'd sit with Tom for hours in the den, not talking much, just watching old westerns or baseball games, his presence a silent anchor. He became adept at reading the signs of pain, fetching glasses of water, adjusting pillows, his teenage awkwardness dissolving into a tenderness that left me breathless. The night Tom finally slipped away, a quiet release in the dim hospice room, it was David who held me as I sobbed, my tears soaking into his shirt. He was only 17, but his arms around me felt solid, steady, like the man his father had taught him to be. He didn't cry then, he just held me, his jaw set, bearing the weight of my grief alongside his own. In that moment, he was my rock, My kind, good-hearted boy. I looked at him through my tears and saw not just my son, but the living legacy of his father's decency. After Tom was gone, the house on Maple Street felt cavernous, filled with echoing silence where once there had been conversation, with hollow spaces where a large, loving presence used to be. David went off to college, a proud and aching milestone, and I rattled around in the quiet, a ghost in my own home. Our Sunday phone calls became my lifeline, the anchor of my week. I'd wait by the phone, and his voice, deepening into full adulthood, would travel down the line, filling the emptiness with stories of classes and roommates and his new life. I lived for those calls, for the sound of his laughter, even if it was about things I didn't fully understand. He met Clara in his final year. He spoke of her with a wonder in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a child describing a magic trick. "She's amazing, Mom. She's so smart. You'll love her." The first time he brought her home for a weekend, I was a nervous wreck. I wanted so desperately for her to like us, to see the warmth in our simple, worn-smooth life, to understand the kind of man David had come from. Clara was polished. That was the word that came to mind immediately. She came from the city and she carried its rhythm with her, a certain poised efficiency, a clarity of purpose. She was undeniably smart, ambitious, beautiful in a crisp, magazine-perfect way. She talked about marketing campaigns, brand synergy, and market saturation over the pot roast I'd nervously overcooked. I nodded and smiled, understanding only every third word, but captivated by how David looked at her. He was dazzled, completely captivated. It was as if he had been living in comfortable candlelight and she was a brilliant, sharp, fluorescent beam. He hung on her every word, his eyes wide with admiration. He had found a new sun to orbit, and his gravitational pull was entirely toward her. I baked my best apple pie, the one with the lattice crust Tom always loved. I showed her Tom's garden, now tended by a neighbor, explaining which roses were his pride and joy. I tried with every fiber of my being to bridge the gap between our worlds, to say, "See? This is love, too. It's in the pie crust and the rose bushes. Please be gentle with my boy's heart, which is partly made of these things." They got married in a beautiful, elegant ceremony in a downtown city hotel. It was nothing like Tom's and my simple church wedding, followed by a potluck in the church hall. This was a curated event, designer dresses, a 5-tier cake, a DJ who commanded the dance floor with professional zeal. I felt a little lost, a sparrow among swans, in my mother-of-the-groom dress that felt both too fancy and not fancy enough. But then, during the slow dances, David found me. He took my hand and led me to the floor. As we swayed, surrounded by the glittering lights and the sophisticated hum of conversation, he squeezed my hand tight, leaned close, and whispered into my hair, "I love you, Mom." In that moment, the opulent ballroom faded away. It was just me and my boy, the same boy from the blanket fort, and his words were the only anchor I needed. That was all that mattered. Life moved on as it does. David and Clara built their careers with fierce focus. They bought a big, beautiful house in a new suburb, all sleek lines, vaulted ceilings, and open-concept spaces filled with minimalist furniture in shades of gray and beige. It was stunning, like a page from a designer catalog. But it didn't feel like a home yet, at least not to me. It felt like a showroom, a stage set for a successful life. There were no scuff marks on the baseboards, no faded spots on the couch from years of lounging, no beloved, ugly knickknacks cluttering the surfaces. But I was happy for them. This was their dream, the tangible fruit of their hard work. They'd invite me for holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and I'd come, my old station wagon loaded with Tupperware containers of my traditional dishes, filling their pristine stainless steel fridge with food I knew they'd likely not finish, trying to help, to contribute, to inject a little of my own flavor of warmth into their beautiful, cool space. Then the accident. It wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was mundane and stupid. I slipped on a patch of black ice getting my mail at the end of the driveway, a broken hip. Just like that, the independence I had clung to since Tom's death was ripped away. Rehab was a grueling, humbling journey of pain and frustration. The thought of going back to the empty, 2-story house on Maple Street, with its daunting staircase and silent rooms, felt not just lonely, but terrifyingly impossible. For the first time, true fear took root, fear of falling, of being helpless, of the immense, yawning silence. I was scared. And I was so profoundly lonely I could taste it, metallic and cold at the back of my throat. It was David who called. His voice came down the line, not with its usual hurried cheer, but filled with that old, familiar concern I remembered from when Tom was sick. "Mom," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is silly. You're coming to live with us. We have the guest suite. It's perfect. It's all on one floor. Let us take care of you for a while." Before I could even form a protest, Clara was on the other extension. Her voice was sweet, reassuring, impeccably kind. "Absolutely, Mom. We've been thinking about it anyway. You shouldn't be alone. Not after all you've done. We want you here." I sank into my recliner, the phone pressed to my ear, and tears of pure, unadulterated relief streamed down my face. My boy. My good, kind boy. He was saving me. They were both saving me. It felt like a sacred circle closing, like family taking care of its own in the way it was always meant to. It was the answer to my silent, terrified prayers. "Tom," I thought, "they're doing it. Our boy is a good man." So with a heart full of gratitude and a tinge of inevitable sorrow, I sold the house on Maple Street. The house of laughter, of ghostly echoes of Tom's voice, of the phantom traces of flower footprints. It hurt, a deep, visceral ache to sign those papers, to hand over the keys to a young couple who saw only potential, not the lifetime of memories embedded in the very walls. But it felt necessary, the price of admission to safety and family. I gave away furniture that held too many stories to take, packed my treasures, photo albums, Tom's watch, David's childhood drawings, into cardboard boxes, and let David load them into a rental truck. I left my world and moved into the sleek, modern, beautiful home of my son and his wife. For the first few months, it was a dream, a honeymoon period of gratitude and hope. I tried so hard with every ounce of my being to be the perfect guest, the ideal live-in mother. I rose early to make breakfast. I cooked elaborate dinners, reclaiming my kitchen territory with familiar recipes. I cleaned with a fervor, organizing cabinets, folding laundry with meticulous care, polishing the already spotless granite counters until they shone. I made myself useful, indispensable even. David would come home from work, shrug off his suit jacket, and walk into the aromatic kitchen, wrapping me in a hug. "Something smells amazing, Mom," he'd say, and for a moment it was like the old days. We'd eat dinner together at their long, modern dining table, and he'd tell me about his day, his projects, his colleagues. Clara would chat about her clients and presentations, and I would listen, nodding, feeling included. It felt whole, stitched back together. Like I had a purpose again, a role to play. Like I was part of a family unit, no longer a solitary satellite orbiting from a distance. I'd look at them across the table, the soft light from the trendy pendant lamp glowing above them, and I'd think, "Tom, you'd be so proud. You'd be so proud. Our boy. He did good. He's a good man." That was the setup. That was the calm, happy, hopeful picture I held in my heart. The family reunited. The mother cared for in her time of need. The son, honoring the memory of his father by honoring his mother. It was the story I had always hoped for, the fairy tale ending after loss and fear. It was everything I thought I needed. I was so deeply immersed in my own gratitude, so blinded by the relief of belonging, that I didn't see the hairline cracks beginning to form in the beautiful facade. I was too busy feeling thankful to notice how the house could sometimes fall into a deep, museum-like quiet when Clara was working late and David was scrolling on his phone. I didn't fully register how Clara's smiles of thanks when I handed her a stack of perfectly folded sweaters sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes, stopping at her cheeks like a practiced maneuver. I glossed over how David began to retreat to his home office more frequently after dinner. The click of the door, a soft but distinct period at the end of our evening. I told myself comforting stories. They were busy, ambitious young people building their empire. They needed their private time as a couple. My presence was a comfort in the background, a steady, gentle hum. I convinced myself that the occasional tension I felt was just my own insecurity, the ghost of Maple Street not yet fully laid to rest. I had no idea, not a single clue, that in my desperate attempt to be useful, to be loved, to belong, I was slowly, quietly, and irrevocably transforming from a cherished mother into a problem waiting to be solved. The stage was set, the characters in place, and the first act of our family tragedy had drawn to a deceptively peaceful close. The storm was still far over the horizon, but the air, had I been brave enough to truly breathe it in, was already beginning to change. The first crack was so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of a shared life, that I almost mistook it for nothing. Almost. It was a Thursday, a gray, drizzly Thursday that seemed to cling to the windows of their beautiful house. Seeking to dispel the gloom, I turned to my oldest, most reliable alchemy, the transforming power of a slow-cooked meal. I made Tom's pot roast, the recipe written in his looping handwriting on a stained index card, a dish that was less about ingredients and more about incantation. The sear of the meat, the patience of the simmer, the holy trinity of carrots, potatoes, and onions melting into a rich, herb-scented gravy. It was David's absolute favorite, a taste of his childhood, of safety, of a time when love was a given and not a negotiation. By late afternoon, the house was enveloped in a warm, savory fog, a smell that spoke of care and coming home. Clara arrived first, the sharp click-click-click of her heels on the tile floor a familiar announcement. She walked into the kitchen, her tailored coat still on, her leather work bag slung over a shoulder, and she stopped. She didn't take a deep, appreciative breath. She didn't smile at the comforting scene. She just looked at the heavy ceramic pot on the stove, her expression unreadable, a slight furrow between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. "Oh," she said, the word a neutral placeholder. "You cooked." "Pot roast," I said, wiping my hands on my apron, a hopeful smile on my face. "David's favorite. It'll be ready by the time he gets home." "Right," she said, her voice flat. She set her bag down with precise care, then moved to the stainless steel refrigerator, its surface a mirror to my own slightly blurred, aproned reflection. She opened it and pulled out a clear plastic container filled with a uniform mix of kale, spinach, and shredded chicken. "Well, I'm doing a cleanse this week, just greens for me. And David and I," she continued, her back to me as she placed the container on the counter, "we're trying to eat lighter in the evenings. More lean protein, less gravy." She said the word gravy as if it were a synonym for something vaguely shameful, something that contaminated. I felt the sting then, sharp and sudden, a tiny puncture in the balloon of my contentment. "Oh," I managed, the smile stiffening on my face. "I didn't know." "It's fine," she said, turning, offering a brief, tight smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Maybe just check with me before you do big meals. It's easier to plan that way." "Of course," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. I turned back to the stove, stirring the rich, bubbling gravy that now felt like a transgression, a messy, emotional relic in her clean, controlled world. When David came home, the dynamic shifted again. He pushed through the front door, shoulders slumped with the weight of the day, but as he stepped into the fragrant hallway, he paused. He sniffed the air and his whole posture changed. His face lit up with a genuine, boyish delight that sent a fleeting pang of joy through my own wounded heart. "Mom's pot roast," he exclaimed, his voice warm. For a glorious second, he was my little boy again, home from school, hungry for the taste of home. But the moment was ephemeral. Clara spoke from the kitchen doorway, where she was now arranging his grilled chicken on a plate with surgical neatness. "David, remember our nutrition plan? I've got your chicken ready. It's measured for your macros." His face fell, just a fraction, the light in his eyes dimming. He looked from my hopeful face at the stove to Clara's composed, expectant one in the doorway. I saw it, a tiny, fleeting flicker of conflict, a silent war between the comfort of his past and the dictated order of his present. It was there and gone in a heartbeat. Then he shrugged, a gesture of surrender, leaned over to kiss Clara on the cheek, and said to me, "Smells incredible, Mom. Maybe I'll have just a little taste." He did. A tiny, apologetic portion on the edge of his plate, dwarfed by the bland, perfect chicken. He ate it quickly, almost furtively, and he did not meet my eyes for the rest of the meal. That was the first time I felt like a stranger in my own actions, like an intruder in the narrative of their life. My love, expressed through the labor of my hands and the memory of his father, had been officially categorized as an inconvenience, a disruption to their carefully curated plan. The crack had appeared, a hairline fracture in the foundation of our new family unit, and a chill began to seep in through it. The cracks kept coming after that. They were never loud, never dramatic confrontations. They were whispers, sighs, the subtle rearrangement of a space to erase my imprint. I bought a bright yellow ceramic teapot at a quaint little shop, a cheerful, sunshiny thing with a painted daisy on the side, to replace their austere stainless steel kettle that always felt cold to the touch and whistled with an industrial shriek. It made my morning tea ritual feel cozy, a small reclaiming of a morning moment. It sat on the stove for a few days, a spot of warmth in the monochrome kitchen. Then one evening it was simply gone. When I asked, Clara didn't look up from her laptop. "The yellow clashed with the aesthetic, Mom. It was a bit much. I put it in your room." And there it was on my dresser, a cheerful exile. My attempt to add warmth was deemed visually offensive. My preference for watching the evening news in the living room, a lifelong habit of feeling connected to the wider world, was quietly thwarted when Clara began a rigorous yoga practice at exactly 6:30 p.m., unrolling her mauve mat in the very center of the living room floor, her serene poses and controlled breathing making the blare of the television feel like a vulgar intrusion. I would sit in my armchair, the news anchors silently mouthing crises on the muted screen, their faces reflected in the dark window behind her bending form, a silent tableau of my displacement. But the most corrosive cracks were the auditory ones, the snippets of conversation I was never meant to hear. Late at night, the house settling into silence, I'd lie in my bed in the back room, and their voices, hushed but carrying the tension of a suppressed argument, would drift through my closed door. "It just feels like she's always there, David. I can't even decompress in my own living room." Clara's voice, a strained whisper sharp with frustration. A low mumble from David, weary, placating. "She's just trying to help, she's lonely." Clara's retort, quick as a knife. "I know, but it's our home, our space. I feel like I can't breathe sometimes. I need you to understand that." A long pause, then David's voice, hollow and defeated. "What do you want me to do, Clara?" Then silence, heavier and more telling than any shout. In the dark, my heart would pound a frantic, shameful rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't trying to be in the way. I was trying, with every fatting fiber of my being, to belong, to be a quiet, helpful presence. But with every overheard word, I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller, folding in on myself to take up less psychic space. I initiated a quiet retreat. I began staying in my room for long hours, only emerging for meals I had specifically cleared with Clara beforehand. I accepted the small tablet David had given me one Christmas and watched my programs there, with headphones on, a tiny island of sound in a sea of my own imposed silence. The most painful erosion, however, was in David himself. He was changing, or perhaps the man he had always been beneath the sun I knew was finally surfacing. The little boy who would burst into the kitchen, spilling over with stories of his day, was gone. In his place was a man who was physically present but profoundly absent. Our conversations, once meandering and full of shared history, dwindled into transactional exchanges about the weather, a neutral comment on a television show we'd both half-watched, the safe, barren territory of surface chatter. He stopped asking about Mrs. Henderson from down the street on Maple or my old friends from the library. He never, not once, mentioned his father. It was as if Tom, and the entire world that built him, had become an embarrassing, sentimental secret. He was pulling away not with a decisive, clean break, but with a slow, steady, cowardly retreat. It fostered a loneliness so profound it made the emptiness of my house after Tom's death seem simple and honest. That was a loneliness of absence. This was a loneliness of presence, of being surrounded by the living, breathing evidence of my own irrelevance. It was a loneliness constructed from polite smiles that never reached the eyes, from closed doors, from the sound of laughter in the next room that abruptly stopped when I entered. The big crack, the one that shattered the fragile illusion completely, happened on my 69th birthday. I didn't expect a party or gifts or any fuss, but I suppose I harbored a childlike, stubborn hope for a gesture, a supermarket cake with thick, sweet frosting, a card with a generic, kind message, maybe just the words, "Happy birthday, Mom," spoken aloud. The day dawned and proceeded with a crushing normalcy. Breakfast was silent, both of them absorbed in their phones. David left for work with a distracted bye. Clara, working from home that day, was sequestered in her office, the rhythmic tap of her keyboard a constant, indifferent percussion. By mid-afternoon, the hope had withered into a sad, heavy stone in my chest. By evening, it had dissolved into a cold, clear understanding. I moved through the quiet house, a ghost in my own non-celebration, and decided to make a cup of tea, a small, solitary act of self-acknowledgement. As I passed their home office, the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting across the darkened hallway. I heard David's voice, not weary now, but light, conversational, talking to a friend on the phone. No, we didn't do anything. Totally slipped my mind. To be honest, man, Clara's got a huge presentation tomorrow and I'm swamped with this quarterly review. It just didn't register. A pause, a low chuckle from him that felt like a physical blow. Yeah, I know. I'll just get her some flowers this weekend, make a dinner reservation, say we're celebrating late. She won't mind. She's easygoing about that stuff. I stopped dead. The hallway seemed to tilt. He was talking about me, my own son. The baby I had carried for 9 months, whose birthdays I had celebrated with fanfare for decades, making themed cakes shaped like dinosaurs and spaceships, wrapping presents with clumsy, loving care. The young man whose birthday I never missed, not even the first devastating one after Tom died, when I'd sobbed through the entire process of baking his favorite chocolate cake because the absence was so loud. I always made a cake. I always had a card. I always remembered. He had forgotten. Not just forgotten, but had to be reminded of the omission by a friend. And his solution was not remorse, but a calculated, casual plan to lie to me, to paper over the neglect with a belated, perfunctory gesture. The betrayal wasn't in the forgetting. Life is busy, memories fail. The betrayal was in the tone, the easy dismissal, the assumption that I was easygoing enough to be placated with a cheap bouquet and a meal that would feel like a pity offering. I stood there, frozen in that strip of light, the knowledge seeping into me, cold and final. I didn't confront him. What words could possibly bridge that chasm? To articulate the hurt would be to beg for a kindness he had clearly decided was no longer mandatory. I went to my room, closed the door, and for the first time since moving into this beautiful, cold house, I cried. Not delicate, ladylike tears, but heavy, silent sobs that racked my frame. I cried for Tom, for the partner who would have never let this happen. I cried for the little boy in the flower footprints who was lost to me forever. I cried for myself, for the woman who now felt so profoundly, utterly unwanted, a calendar page that had been turned without a glance. That was the moment the setup, the beautiful fiction of a reunited family, truly and irrevocably shattered. The dream was over. The pretense was vaporized. I was no longer a mother living with her son. I was a tenant, a financial and emotional obligation, a forgotten birthday. The knowledge settled into my bones, a permanent cold weight. From that day forward, the atmosphere in the house changed. It grew thick with unspoken truths and perfunctory interactions. My smiles, when I could muster them, felt stiff and crackly on my face. Their kindness, when they displayed it, felt forced, a choreographed performance. We were all actors in a dying play called Happy Family. But the script had been lost, the director had abandoned us, and none of us knew our lines anymore. We moved around each other with careful, weary politeness, speaking in code, avoiding eye contact. The air was stale with disappointment. We were no longer a family navigating tension. We were coexisting casualties waiting for the final, merciful curtain to fall, each of us secretly hoping it would drop soon, so the painful performance could finally end. The turning point, the moment that cleaved my life into a stark before and after, did not arrive with the slam of a door, the shatter of thrown china, or the raw, tearing sound of a shouting match. It came on a sigh of paper, a soft, glossy rustle that was somehow more final than any explosion of anger could ever be. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that seems to stretch into eternity, weighted down by a quiet so profound you can hear not just the clock tick, but the hum of the refrigerator, the distant whir of a neighbor's lawnmower, the slow, weary passage of time itself. The house felt like a held breath. I was in the kitchen, performing a familiar, pointless ritual, wiping down counters that were already pristine, chasing an invisible speck of dust with a damp cloth, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence. It was a pantomime of usefulness, my latest desperate attempt to be invisible in a helpful way, to prove my value through antiseptic surfaces and orderly cupboards. Every swipe of the cloth was a silent plea. See, I take up so little space. I create no mess. I am not a burden. Then, the sound of her footsteps. Clara walked in, and the atmosphere shifted instantly, the quiet hardening from peaceful to pressurized. She had that look. It was a look I had come to recognize in subtle ways over the past months, but now it was fully formed, unconcealed. It was the look of someone who has conducted a long, internal debate, reached a difficult but resolute conclusion, and is now steeling every nerve to execute it with cool efficiency. There was no softness in her eyes, only the focused determination of a surgeon about to make an incision. And in her hand, held with purposeful casualness, was a glossy, trifold brochure. My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted, a cold, heavy stone dropping through the hollow cavity of my chest, landing with a silent, internal thud at my feet. I knew. I don't know how, perhaps it was the too careful way she held it, perhaps it was the finality in her posture, but a primal, cellular knowledge seized me. I knew what was in her hand before she ever turned it to face me. Slowly, as if moving through syrup, I placed the damp cloth on the counter, the action feeling like a surrender. "Mom," she said. The word was a tool, a way to begin the conversation, devoid of its usual, however strained, warmth. "Can we talk?" It wasn't a question. It was an announcement. I said nothing. I simply stood there, my hands now empty and useless at my sides, waiting for the sentence to be pronounced. "We've been thinking," she began, her voice a masterclass in measured delivery. Each word was chosen, weighed, and placed with precision. "About your future, your long-term comfort and happiness." She stepped forward and laid the brochure flat on the granite counter between us, smoothing it with a palm as if presenting a crucial document. I looked down. Sunset Springs Senior Community was written in elegant, serene script across the top. Below, a photoshopped paradise unfolded. Beautiful, low-rise buildings of cheerful beige brick nestled among impossibly green lawns and vibrant flower beds. There were pictures of happy, white-haired seniors, always in pairs or cheerful groups, laughing over a game of cards, doing gentle stretching in a sun-dappled studio, walking hand-in-hand on a manicured path. They looked vibrant, carefree, social. They did not look like people whose presence had become a silent friction in their children's homes. They did not look like they had been gently, firmly packaged up and sent away. "It's only 20 minutes from here," Clara continued, her finger tapping a small map on the brochure. "So we could visit easily. They have wonderful activities, book clubs, movie nights, all sorts of things. There's a nurse on call 24/7, which is such a relief for peace of mind. And the meal plans are chef-prepared, nutritious." She was selling it. She was giving me the features and benefits as if I were a client evaluating a service, not a mother being evicted from her son's home. "It's a truly wonderful place. You'd have your own lovely, spacious apartment, your own kitchenette, your own bathroom, your own space." She emphasized those last two words, imbuing them with the promise of freedom, but all I heard was the label of exclusion. Your own space meant not our space. "We think it's time," she said, her voice dipping into a tone of compassionate firmness she must have practiced. "For you to have your independence back, to be with people your own age, to have a real social life again. And," she paused, a beat of calculated hesitation, "for David and I too to focus on starting our own family. It's something we really want to pursue, and we feel we need our own space, our own privacy, to do that properly." The addition was a masterstroke, a low blow delivered with surgical kindness. They wanted to start a family, a grandchild, the one thing that might have given my life in their home new meaning, a new role, a beloved purpose. And I was being framed not just as an inconvenience, but as an active obstacle to that dream. The future grandmother was in the way of the future parents. My very existence was now inhibiting the creation of new life. The cruelty of the framing took my breath away. It weaponized my deepest, unspoken hope against me. All I could manage was a whisper, a thread of sound pulled from a place of sheer devastation. "David agrees," I asked, my eyes still fixed on the smiling strangers on the brochure, unable yet to look for my son. As if summoned by his cue in this grim play, David shuffled into the kitchen doorway. He didn't enter fully. He lingered on the threshold, a permanent spectator, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a defensive posture, a shield. His gaze was everywhere but on me. He studied the ceiling with sudden, intense interest, then the pattern of the floor tiles, then his own shoes. He looked like a teenager caught in a lie, not a grown man deciding his mother's fate. "Mom," he said, and his voice was the worst part. It was flat, dull, devoid of the rich timbre I remembered, emptied of all emotion except a profound weariness. It's a really nice place. We've looked into it. I've toured it. The facilities are top-notch. He swallowed and finally forced his eyes to meet mine for a fleeting, agonizing second. It's for the best. For the best. The three words hung in the sterile kitchen air, toxic and absolute. They echoed, twisting in my mind. 2 years ago, for the best was the urgent, loving call that pulled me from the terror of solitude after my fall. You're coming to live with us, it's for the best. Now, for the best was this glossy brochure, this polite deportation. The phrase was a hollow shell, its meaning entirely defined by their convenience. My needs, my heart, were irrelevant to its new definition. I looked at my son, my David. I searched his face, that face I had kissed 1,000 times, whose every contour was as familiar to me as my own, for any flicker of the boy I knew. I looked for conflict, for the pain of a difficult choice, for the stubborn love that would have at least made this moment agonizing for him. I saw none of it. What I saw was profound discomfort. The pained expression of a man who wanted an awkward, unpleasant interaction to be over. He wanted me to take the brochure, to agree, to make this easy for him. He wanted the problem of me to be solved, neatly and finally. In that moment, any lingering illusion that he was a captive to Clara's will evaporated. This was a collaboration. He was an active, silent partner in my removal. His presence in the doorway, his muted endorsement, was his signature on the deed. That was the moment the last thread, the final frayed filament of hope that connected me to the son I thought I'd raised, snapped. The love I felt for him didn't vanish. A mother's love is a stubborn, tenacious force. But it was instantly, completely buried under an avalanche, a glacier of betrayal so cold it burned. This was his choice. He was choosing. Not in the noble way a man chooses his wife, but in the cowardly way he was choosing the path of least resistance, choosing his own peace over my security, choosing to not love me enough to defend me, enough to say no, enough to honor the promise he himself had made. He wasn't choosing Clara over me. He was choosing his own comfort over his duty to me. The distinction was subtle and devastating. A flood of emotions, a torrent of hurt so acute it was physical, a geyser of anger at the injustice, a paralyzing fear of the lonely future depicted in that brochure, threatened to overwhelm me. I felt my chin begin to quiver, my eyes begin to sting. I braced for the collapse, for the tears that would finally come, for the raw, begging sobs that would humiliate me completely. But then, from beneath that approaching storm, from that new, icy core the betrayal had created, something else surfaced. A deep, preternatural calm. A stillness so absolute it was like stepping outside of my own body. And with it, arising unbidden from some deep well of survival, came the smile. I felt my lips curve upward. It wasn't the smile of joy or agreement or madness. It was the smile of release. The smile of a prisoner watching the jailer fumble with the keys, realizing the lock was on the inside all along. I reached out, my hand steady, and picked up the glossy brochure from the cool granite. I looked at it, then back at Clara, my smile never wavering. "Thank you for thinking of me," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, eerily calm, pleasant, almost conversational. It was the voice of a woman accepting a slightly disappointing gift, not the voice of a mother being exiled. "This looks very nice. I appreciate you going to the trouble." The shock on Clara's face was immediate and vivid. Her eyes widened a fraction. Her perfectly composed mask slipped for a single, revealing instant. She had braced for tears, for arguments, for guilt. My serene acceptance was a script deviation she hadn't rehearsed for. The shock was quickly, expertly masked by a wave of palpable relief that softened her shoulders. She had gotten what she wanted, and it had been even easier than she'd hoped. David, finally drawn out of his studied avoidance, looked directly at me, his confusion plain. He blinked, his brow furrowed. He had expected a scene that would validate his own discomfort, a drama that would cast him in the role of the long-suffering son. My quiet dignity disarmed him completely, leaving him off balance and strangely diminished. "I'll start packing," I said, my tone still light, almost breezy. I folded the brochure neatly in half, then in half again, and held it in my hand as I turned. I walked past David in the doorway. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't reach out. I walked down the familiar hallway, past the gallery of their happy, motherless memories, and into the little room at the back of the house. That was the true turning point. Not their cold, calculated request, but my peaceful, unassailable acceptance. In that smile, in that preternatural calm, I had stepped completely out of the role they had written for me, the burdensome, needy, emotional mother. I had refused the script. I stopped fighting for a place in a story where I was not a wanted character. The fight to belong, to be loved, to be seen as family, that exhausting, soul-crushing fight was over. And in surrendering that fight, in letting go of the desperate grip on a dream that was already dead, I found a tiny, hard seed of power. It was the power of detachment, the power of witness. I was no longer merely a victim of their betrayal. By accepting it with grace, I had transformed myself into a witness to it. I would observe the consequences of this choice, not as a participant begging for a different outcome, but as someone watching a play unfold to its inevitable end. I would pack my boxes. I would leave with my head held high, my tears shed in private. I would live. The smile had been my declaration of independence, far more real than the one promised in the brochure. It said, "You cannot break me because I am no longer holding on to you." But as I sat on the edge of my bed in that quiet room, the folded brochure like a cold stone in my hand, I felt a strange certainty settle over me. The universe, in its vast, silent mechanics, operates on balances. This act, this severing of a sacred bond for the sake of convenience and space had weight. It had set something in motion. I was a witness now, yes, but I was not the only one watching. The deed was done. The choice was made. And karma, that quiet, patient force, was just about to step out of the shadows and into the light of their perfectly curated living room. I moved into Sunset Springs. To call it an adjustment would be to dress a profound uprooting in the gentlest of terms. It was fine. A neutral beige word for a neutral beige existence. My apartment was a single room with a kitchenette along one wall and a bathroom so compact you could almost wash your hands while sitting on the toilet. The walls were painted a color the management company likely called warm sand, but which felt, to me, like dried bone. The low-pile carpet was a resilient, stain-hiding taupe. The window looked out onto a small, concrete courtyard where a single, determined birch tree struggled for sun. Everything was clean, safe, quiet, and utterly devoid of the fingerprints of life. It was a space designed for existence, not for living. The food in the communal dining hall was nutritious, balanced, and uniformly bland, as if flavor had been deemed an unnecessary extravagance, a potential agitator for elderly digestive systems. The people were, for the most part, kind. We were a community united by geography and a shared, unspoken understanding. Everyone carried, tucked into a pocket or worn on a weary face, a story of loss, the loss of a spouse, the loss of a home, the loss of independence, and most poignantly, the loss of proximity to families who were now too busy with lives that had expanded as ours had contracted. We were the gently shelved volumes, our most exciting chapters presumed to be behind us. I became one of them. I learned the rhythms of the place. Bingo on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the soft clatter of beans on cardboard a soundtrack to mild hope. Gentle yoga on Wednesdays, where we moved with careful deliberation, preserving what mobility we had left. I took up knitting again, my hands, which had once cooked pot roasts and bandaged knees, now producing endless, soft scarves in muted colors, items with no intended recipient, simply for the solace of the repetitive motion. And I waited. Not with active anticipation, but with the passive, weary patience of someone for whom time has become a vast, flat landscape to be crossed one slow day at a time. My tether to my old life was the Sunday phone call with David. It was a ritual stripped of all substance, a weekly check-in that felt more like a bureaucratic obligation than a family conversation. The phone would ring at precisely 4 p.m., as if scheduled in his digital calendar. "Call Mom, 15 mins." "How are you, Mom?" he'd ask, his voice traveling down the line, familiar yet distant, like a radio station slightly out of range. "I'm fine, dear," I answer, my standard, cheerful non-answer. "The weather's been nice, we had meatloaf today." "That's good," he'd reply. "How are you?" I'd return. "Busy," he'd say, the go-to word for a life too full to describe. "Good, work is good." And there we would linger in a desert of polite, empty phrases, two strangers performing a pantomime of connection, the silence between our words filled with the ghost of everything we could not or would not say. We were curating our conversations, presenting sanitized, emotionless summaries of our weeks. The canyon between us was no longer one of anger. It was one of profound, awkward irrelevance. For nearly a year, my life was a flat line on a monitor, a sustained, beige hum. I began to accept that this was the coda, the final, quiet movement of my symphony. The rest of my story would be measured in bingo games, knit stitches, and the weekly, hollow echo of my son's voice. I had borne the betrayal, I had moved on, and this was the aftermath, a peaceful, lonely plateau. I thought the story was over, but karma, I was to learn, is not a lightning bolt of divine retribution. It is the slow, inexorable force of cause and effect, and it had only just begun to stir. It didn't arrive with thunder or dramatic pronouncements. It came in a series of quiet whispers, so subtle I almost mistook them for the ordinary misfortunes of life. The first whisper was about David's job, the big, important, soul-consuming tech company where he had built his identity, the source of the impressive title, the sleek business cards, the mortgage on the beautiful. Cold House underwent a strategic realignment. In simpler terms, they had layoffs. David, who had always been so sure, so driven, so defined by his position in that corporate hierarchy, was cut loose. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon, breaking the unspoken Sunday rule, and his voice was unmoored, shaky, stripped of its usual confident sheen. "Mom," he said, and he sounded like a teenager who had just crashed the car. They let me go. The whole division." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of him trying to control his breath. "Mom, what do I do?" In that fractured question, I heard the ghost of my little boy, the one who would come to me with a broken toy, believing I could fix anything. My heart ached for him, a pure, maternal pang that cut through the layers of hurt. I offered the soft, useless words one offers in the face of catastrophe. "I'm so sorry, David, it will be okay. You'll find something." But beneath my sympathy I also heard the new, sharp edge in his voice, the fear, not just of failure, but of the practical, crushing weight of the life he had built. The fear of the mortgage payments on the showroom house, the car leases, the lifestyle that demanded a constant high-pressure influx of cash. The foundation of his carefully constructed world had developed a sudden, seismic crack. Then, the whispers grew louder, and they were about the space between them. Clara's career, the one that demanded such focus and provided such a convenient rationale for so much, did not falter. It accelerated. That huge presentation became a springboard to a major promotion, a vice presidency that came with a significant salary increase and a travel schedule that was punishing. She was now gone more than she was home, flying to coastal cities for meetings, living out of sleek carry-on luggage in hotel rooms that all looked the same. The stress in their marriage, for which my presence had once been a convenient, unifying scapegoat, now had a new, more intimate source, absence. They were alone together in that cavernous, quiet house, and they were drifting apart in the silence. The shared project of managing Mom, as exhausting and divisive as it had been, was a project. It was something to discuss, to strategize over, a common problem. With that problem solved and shipped off to Sunset Springs, they were left staring at each other across a widening gulf, realizing they had built a beautiful container for a partnership that had grown thin and brittle. They had less to talk about. The business of their lives had become parallel, not intersecting.
The final whisper, the one that carried the weight of profound irony, came from a doctor's office. They had been trying for the family Clara had so pointedly mentioned as a reason for my departure. Month after month, the hope would rise, and then be dashed with a cruel, regular punctuality. Tests were run, a silent, clinical exploration of their most intimate selves. The problem, it was gently, professionally explained, was likely on Clara's side. It was a blow she had not seen coming. Clara, who planned every aspect of her life with military precision, who believed in the direct correlation between effort and result, was confronted with a biological reality that refused to conform to her spreadsheets and 5-year plans. The perfect, linear sequence: stellar education, thriving career, beautiful home, and then, as the crowning achievement, a perfectly timed baby was crumbling. Her ambition, which had taken her soaring away from home, now seemed to have stolen from her the very dream she had ostensibly been making space for. The house they had wanted empty for a family now echoed with the silence of that missing child. It was after this, on a nondescript evening when the sky outside my beige window was the color of old bruises, that David called. He didn't sound busy. He didn't sound like anything at all. He sounded hollowed out, lost in a way that went deeper than unemployment. Mom, he said. After a silence so long, I thought the connection had failed. Do you remember when I was little, and I failed that math test, the big one on fractions, and I was so scared to tell you and Dad? The question, coming out of the blue, landed in the center of my chest. I could see it instantly. His small, worried face, the crumpled test paper with the big red F hidden in his backpack. I remember, I said softly, my throat suddenly tight. You hid in your fort in the living room. You wouldn't come out for supper. A ragged breath came down the line. And Dad, he didn't yell, he just crawled right in there with me, even though he was way too big. He sat there, squished up, and he said, well, it looks like the numbers won today, but they don't get to win tomorrow. We'll try again tomorrow. David's voice was thick with memory, and he did. He helped me study every single night that week. He made fractions with my Jews. He was a good father, I said, the words barely more than a whisper, tears pricking at my eyes for Tom, for the man who knew that love was shown in patience, in presence, in crawling into the dark fort with you. I'm not. The confession was a mere whisper, so quiet I strained to hear it. Then, the dam he had been building for years, the dam of excuses, of compliance, of quiet betrayal. He began to cry, not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching, ugly sobs that tore out of him, raw and unfiltered. They were the sobs of a man whose foundation has turned to sand. I'm a terrible son, he gasped between heaving breaths. I'm a terrible husband. I don't know what I'm doing. I pushed you away. I let Clara. I just let it happen. I was weak, Mom. I was so weak. I chose the easy silence over the hard right thing. I failed you. I failed Dad. I listened. I held the phone to my ear and I let him cry. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, didn't rush to absolve him. I simply bore witness to his breaking, and as I listened, the hollow space inside my own chest, the one carved out by his betrayal, began to fill. But it didn't fill with vindication or smug satisfaction. It filled with a profound, overwhelming, aching sadness for him. This was the consequence. This was the karma, in its purest, most undeniable form. Not a punishment hurled from the heavens, but the natural, organic, painfully grown fruit of the seeds he had planted. He had traded the unconditional, messy, demanding love of family for a clean, stressful, lonely life built on appearances and the avoidance of difficult conversations. He had betrayed a fundamental trust, and in doing so, he had severed his own moral anchor. Now he was adrift in a sea of his own making, watching the beautiful, empty ship of his marriage list, and realizing the life preserver he had thrown overboard was his own mother. He didn't ask to come over. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just fell apart, and for the first time in years, he allowed me to hear it. A few weeks later, on a Saturday morning, there was a knock on my beige apartment door. It was a hesitant, almost apologetic sound. I opened it, and there stood David, alone. He looked older, thinner, as if the events of the past months had physically sanded him down. He was holding a small, pathetic-looking peace lily in a plastic pot from the grocery store, its leaves drooping. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice was tentative, rough from disuse. I let him in. We sat at my small, laminate table. He didn't bring up the past directly. He talked around the edges of the crater. He spoke about his job search, the humbling experience of updating his resume, the strange silence of the house during the day. He asked me, with genuine curiosity, about my knitting, about the patterns I was trying. It was awkward, fragile, like two people trying to converse in a language they'd both half forgot. The air was thick with everything unsaid, but for the first time, the unsaid things weren't accusations, they were regrets, and they hung between us with a different, heavier weight. That he was leaving. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back to me. "The house," he began, his voice strained. "It's too big. It's an echo chamber. We're selling it. Clara's looking at a condo near her new office. The travel it's a lot." He took a shaky breath. I think I'm going to look for something smaller, an apartment, maybe, something closer to here." He finally turned and met my eyes. His were red-rimmed, shadowed, and full of a sorrow I recognized intimately. It was the sorrow of realizing what you have lost only after you've willingly let it go. It was the look of a man standing in the ruins of his own choices.
"I miss you, Mom," he said, the words breaking apart as they left his lips. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he made no move to wipe it away. "I'm so sorry for everything I looked at my son, standing in the doorway of my small, beige life. I saw not the successful executive, not the hesitant husband caught between two women. I saw my boy, the boy from the blanket fort, the boy who failed the math test, the boy who held me when his father died. He was broken, humbled, and trying, with agonizing slowness, to find his way back to a shore he had abandoned. "I miss you too, David," I said, and I meant it with every fractured piece of my heart. The betrayal was a canyon between us, a scar on the landscape of our history, but my love for him was a river that had never, not for 1 second, ceased its flow. It had just been forced underground, running deep beneath the cold, hard rock of his rejection. Now, his tears, his brokenness, had opened a fissure, and that love was finding its way back to the surface, not in a joyous flood, but in a slow, a steady seep of compassion. I did not say I forgive you. Not yet. Those words are not a band-aid to be applied to a wound this deep. Forgiveness is a bridge, painstakingly built over a chasm. And he had only just placed the first, trembling foot on the near side, but I held the door open, both the physical one to my apartment and the metaphorical one to my heart. I let him see that the love was still here, not as a prize for good behavior, but as a stubborn, enduring fact. It was here, on the other side of his poor choices, waiting not to erase the past, but to see if a new, more honest future could be built alongside it. The resolution, then, was not a happy reunion with confetti and healed wounds. It was the quiet, weary settling of dust after a long and devastating storm. Their perfect, glossy life had fractured along its fault lines. My life had contracted into a small, quiet, beige existence. But in that new quiet, there was a brutal, liberating truth. No more pretense. No more performing a happy family for an audience of none. No more glossy brochures papering over cold, hard decisions. The scales, in their own slow, impersonal way, were finding their balance, not with the dramatic revenge I might have once fantasized about in my deepest hurt, but with the heavy, silent, all-too-human weight of regret, consequence, and dawning accountability. And in that fertile ground of regret, watered by his genuine tears, there was a seed, a tiny, fragile, green shoot of a chance for something new, something authentic, something real to grow between us. It would not be the relationship we had before. That was gone, a photograph faded by the light of his betrayal. It would have to be something else, built with the weathered bricks of hard-earned wisdom and the fragile mortar of cautious hope. The road back would be long, winding, and paved with difficult conversations and the constant shadow of what had been lost. But for the first time in years, as I watched my son walk down the hallway of Sunset Springs, his shoulders slumped but his head finally facing in the direction of truth, I could see the road. And that, in itself, was a kind of peace.